The transition begins not with a feeling of liberation, but with a cold, hollow silence. For the person who was raised to be an emotional shock absorber, the moment you stop seeking validation is the moment you stop performing a role you were never supposed to cast in the first place. When you were small, your environment was a series of high-stakes calculations. You learned early that your safety was contingent on your utility. If you could manage the parents' rage, soothe their depression, or anticipate their needs before they even crystallized, you earned a temporary reprieve from the chaos. This wasn't maturity or being an old soul. It was a survival-oriented adaptation to a structural failure of care. You were recruited into a role, the parentified child, where you traded your right to be protected for the responsibility of protecting the peace. The architect of the vigilant mind in those formative years, your nervous system didn't develop for play or exploration. It developed for surveillance. While other children were learning how to fall and be caught, you were learning how to read the micro-shifts in a room's atmosphere. You became a master of threat anticipation. A door closing too firmly, a sigh that lasted a second too long, a specific cadence of footsteps, these weren't just sounds. They were data points. Your brain's threat detection circuitry became hyper-responsive, a state of persistent internal vigilance that never quite powers down. You learned to live in a state of high allostatic load, a wear and tear on the body and mind caused by chronic stress. You weren't strong. You were simply being crushed by a weight you hadn't yet realized was optional. This adaptation meant that your own needs were viewed as a liability. To need care was to be a burden. To express vulnerability was to create a crack in the armor that kept the household functioning. You learned to suppress your emotions not because you lacked them, but because expressing them was dangerous. It would have disrupted the fragile equilibrium of the adults who were supposed to be holding you. So you split. You developed a functional, hyper-independent exterior to manage the world, while the parts of you that required softness were buried under layers of shame. The adult cost of survival. By the time you reached adulthood, these adaptations had hardened into your personality. You became the person everyone can count on, the one who has it all together. But this hyper-independence is a trauma response, not a virtue. It is the refusal to be seen in a state of lack because, in your history, lack led to abandonment or further burden. You find rest repulsive. To sit still is to invite the anxiety of the unmonitored space. If you aren't doing, fixing, or anticipating, you feel an invisible threat looming. This is the nervous system's inability to distinguish between the absence of a crisis and the presence of safety. For you, the lack of a crisis just means the next one is building quietly in the shadows. Empathy, for you, is guarded. You can read others with surgical precision, but you do so from a distance. You provide support because you know the cost of its absence, but you rarely allow anyone to reciprocate. To be cared for feels like an intrusion, an unwanted debt you aren't sure you can pay back. You are a master of the uneven development of the self. You have the executive function of an elite operative and the emotional regulation of a trapped animal. The collapse of the validation loop. Seeking validation was the fuel for this machine. It was the good job or the thank you that served as proof that you were still useful and therefore still safe. It was the reassurance that you hadn't failed in your primary directive of holding everything together. But then something breaks. Often, it isn't a grand epiphany, but a slow, grinding exhaustion. The body, burdened by decades of chronic stress and the relentless need to be perceived as competent, begins to refuse the terms of the contract. You stop caring if they see you as the strong one. You stop caring if your absence creates a problem for people who have never bothered to learn how to solve their own. When you stop seeking validation, the first thing you lose is your sense of purpose. This is the dark truth. Your identity was built on being the solution to other people's problems. Without that external mirror reflecting back your value, you are forced to sit with the stranger that is your own self. The weight of the silence. What follows is a period of profound disorientation. You experience a shame-based resistance to your own peace. You feel guilty for not being productive. You feel like a fraud for not being on. You realize that your entire social circle may have been built around your willingness to overfunction, and as you stop seeking their approval, some of those connections simply evaporate. They didn't love you. They loved the ease you provided. This is the psychological cost of the environment changing while the internal map remains the same. You are no longer in the burning building, but you are still holding your breath, waiting for the smoke. You have spent your life being the container for everyone else's spills. And now that you are empty, the silence is deafening. You begin to recognize that your reliability was actually a form of self-erasure. You see the unevenness of your development clearly now. You can negotiate a contract or manage a crisis, but you don't know how to ask for a hug without feeling like you're committing a crime. You are hyper-competent in the world of doing, but a novice in the world of being. The sober reality of healing, the process of moving past the need for validation, isn't about finding a new, happier version of yourself. It's about a brutal audit of what was stolen from you. It's acknowledging that you were conditioned to believe that you had to earn the space you occupy. You find yourself in a strange, liminal space. You are no longer driven by the frantic need to be good or helpful, but you haven't yet learned how to be safe. You are hypervigilant about your own hypervigilance. You realize that your empathy was often just a highly developed form of threat assessment. You weren't feeling what they felt because you were kind. You were feeling what they felt so you could stay ahead of their reactions. As the need for validation dies, a certain coldness sets in. It is a necessary coldness. It is the frost that protects the roots. You become less nice, but more honest. You stop explaining yourself. You realize that no is not a negotiation, and your time is not a public resource. The unsettling truth. Eventually you reach a point where you stop looking at the door. You stop scanning the faces of those around you for the subtle signs of disappointment or approval. This is the end of the script, but it is not a happy ending in the traditional sense. It is a sober one. The truth is that you will never be the person who grew up safe. That version of you doesn't exist. You are, and will always be, a person whose foundation was laid in a storm. Healing doesn't mean the storm didn't happen, and it doesn't mean you are now soft. It means you finally understand that the war is over, even if you still jump at the sound of a car backfiring. It means recognizing that the guilt you feel when you rest is just a ghost, a lingering echo of a time when your inactivity was a danger to your survival. The most unsettling realization of all is this. You have been waiting for someone to hand you a certificate of release. A final validation that says you have done enough and can finally stop, but no one is coming to give it to you. The adults who failed you don't have it, and the world that benefited from your overfunctioning won't give it up. You must learn with a heavy, quiet heart that your safety, your rest, and your care no longer require a signature. They are yours by right of existence. A fact that remains true even if you have to spend the rest of your life convincing your own nervous system to believe it.